Welcome to the Backup and Thriving Accessible Travel podcast. My name is Sophie Elwes, and I'm the host for this series. I sustained a spinal cord injury myself back in 2011 and have a T4 complete injury, and I work as head of services at Backup. Over this series, I'll be interviewing a range of guests who all are affected by spinal cord injury, and each episode will look at a different mode of transport. Guests will be sharing their stories, their travel experiences, as well as some fabulous advice. Our hope is that listeners will realise that travelling after spinal cord injury is not only possible, but that it can be life-changing too. Sophie Morgan, welcome to the Backup podcast. How are you?
Thank you very much, Soph. I'm very well. How are you?
Fabulous. All the better for seeing and speaking to you. Very excited for this conversation.
Me too. It's been such a long time as well. So, yes, excited to dig in. Thank you for having me here.
Of course, of course. And tell us, where are you, Sophie, at this moment in time?
So I'm in LA. I moved here in January. So in West Hollywood, to be precise. And it's dreamy, to be honest. So I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Cool. Well, let's get stuck in. First of all, Sophie, for those who perhaps don't know you, would you introduce yourself and tell us kind of about your journey really to Backup and kind of how you got here?
Sure. So I'm Sophie Morgan, and I'm a TV presenter and a disability advocate and a writer and an artist. I do lots of different things. I had a car crash when I was 18 years old, which left me paralysed. For those who understand this, as obviously our audience does, I'm a T5/6 complete. So I've been a wheelchair user my entire adult life. I was paralysed literally at the age of 18. So I came to Backup because after my injury, I went home, and much like, I suppose, many other people, I found myself kind of quite alone in my experience. I didn't know many other wheelchair users at the time. I didn't know anyone with spinal cord injury, apart from those I'd met in the hospital. But obviously, once you leave, you kind of leave that bubble and don't necessarily stay in touch with people in that community. So I was back in my world, and I felt quite isolated at times. And I can't even remember how I found Backup, but it found me at the right time. And I ended up going to the Calvert Trust down in Exmoor to actually just do a kind of multi-activity weekend. And it was super fun. I met loads of other wheelchair users. We did loads of activities, but as was the case always with these Backup experiences, there was this other layer of kind of benefit to being part of the weekend. It was like, meeting other people who had been through, if not obviously similar trauma. We all sustained our injuries in different ways, but there was just this commonality between us that made it really healing. I really enjoyed kind of getting to know people that had spinal injury. In fact, I'm still in touch with them all these years later. Yeah, it really made a difference. And since then I got my dad got really heavily involved with helping fundraise for the charity. And over the years, so he got involved in the city dinner. I think that gave him a huge amount of satisfaction because he was trying to, find ways to help me. And it was obviously such a challenging time for our family. So Dad lent into that kind of like, let's help others that are in the same situation. So helped raise money and put on that event. And over the years, just spent time kind of in the Backup universe in various ways. I became like a patron for the charity, an ambassador for the charity kind of thing. It's been a long relationship, I suppose. And then also how we met, because I was like a mentor. Although we didn't come through Backup, I don't think, did we? We had a mutual friend that connected us up, that when you just had your injury. But I was doing the mentorship thing for a time too.
Yeah, I think it was kind of officially sort of through Backup, but we sort of went a little off piece. We met in the pub. We didn't really...
Well, because we had some mutual friends. And I mean, obviously, like, God, that was right at the beginning of your journey. I remember.
Oh my God, I will never forget that meeting. I'll never forget that. Really changed my trajectory totally, I think.
Really? Oh God, that's amazing. But isn't that the case when you meet others in your situation? You're just like, right, tell me how it's done. What do I need to do?
100%.
Benefit of Backup.
Yeah, totally. Could go into so much detail about, some of those conversations that we had and, what an impact that had. But speaking of going off piste, didn't you go on the Colorado ski course with backup?
Yeah, I did. Absolutely. I did with Jane and Tim Farr and various others. I can't remember everybody. I can't remember everybody's names now. It was so great. Yeah, to Winter Park.
Yeah.
Your old stomping ground, Soph. I went to learn. I loved it. And I vowed to kind of pursue that and persist with skiing. But it just became so difficult being from the UK and the cost of it and the kind of time, you know what it's like. So yeah, it was dream come true doing that. But I did it again a few years later with Jane as well. And then obviously we did some skiing together. So back up again, changed the course of my life, just being able to teach me stuff like that and learn from other people that had done those kind of trips and those kind of, experiences before. And just kind of, there's so much information to mine from one another. It's great. Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned Jane and Tim, who now they founded Access Adventures, but at that time they were involved with backup, the sort of origins of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And obviously Colorado, a lot of people, hearing that it's a long way to fly. Tell me about your first time, if you remember your first flight after your injury. Was that your first flight? Or
it wasn't. It was my first flight came very, very soon after my injury. It was quite an unusual sort of. What happened was I was in the hospital, and the joy of having survived my injury and kind of come out the other side. Yes, I was paralyzed and told I was, all the stuff you're told, you're not going to walk again, not do all this, and all the things of like the list of can'ts just grew and grew and grew. And I remember me and my family just feeling very much like, what is possible? What can she still do? And at the time, my mum and dad had really good family friends in Canada who had reached out and said, how can we help? What can we do? And mum and dad were like, well, maybe she needs to get away. Maybe it was just this kind of, I don't know where the idea came from, if it was them or mum and dad, but the idea was floated that we should just do this trip and get me somewhere else just to get a bit of kind of, I don't know, I suppose, try something new. There was just this bravery about it, this courage that mum and dad were like, let's do this. So we booked a flight to go to Canada, to go to Toronto specifically. And I remember at the time, mum and me being like, right, what do we need to know about flying? And it was, a deep dive into like, what are the challenges? And I remember the OT at the hospital, the occupational therapist, talking us through all the things we'd need to do. So I was told you did need to have an injection that would stop any risk of DVT. I was told you're going to have to sit on your cushion to avoid the risk of pressure sores on the seat. That they taught me through what happens when your wheelchair gets taken away from you. Also, they taught me through you're not going to be able to go to the bathroom, so you're going to have to figure out an alternative. And at the time, the suggestion was an indwelling catheter, because I catheterize intermittently. So the suggestion was, because you're not going to be able to get to the toilet necessarily, use an indwelling for the flight. So I was like, right, okay, we'd do that. So we made this list of all the things that we'd need to prepare for. And obviously then there's the booking process and the going through all of those challenges. And it was absolutely terrifying. I was like, my God, this is like an ordeal just to get to where we wanted to go. But look, at the end of the day, it got me there. I got to Canada. I got through it safely. I landed and my wheelchair was in one piece. I was in one piece. And we had the most incredible experience in Canada. I mean, it changed my life. I was there, I think, after I touched down, a few days later, we were up on the frozen lakes just north of Toronto in a place called Muskoka. And we were snowmobiling. I mean, my dad and his mate plonked me, a newly paralysed 18-year-old, on the back of a skidoo. And we're like, right, we're going that way. 60 miles an hour, keep up, don't stop.
Wow.
And it was like, there's always been that contrast for us in our lived experience, that you can do these extraordinary things in the great outdoors, but then you find these barriers everywhere in like day-to-day life. It was very weirdly, as a learning curve, like I can go on a snowmobile, but I can't go to the toilet on a plane. Like it's like, what can you do? What can't you do? That was the beginning of this journey of learning and unlearning what this life would involve. But look, what I did realise is but two things. One is 21 years later, the flying process is still exactly the bloody same. the problems are still there. They've still got exactly the same challenges. But that is changing. The other part of it was a lot of the advice I was given by the hospital was very much over the top. And it wasn't, they've put the living fear of freaking God in me, because they were like, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to pressure relieve every 30 minutes. And it was so intense. And I obviously followed the rules, but really now I know that each of us should approach these things for how we know our bodies best. The hospital will always make you think that you don't know your body and that they have all the rules and that you've got to follow them. But they aren't you. And you will learn over time that there's things that actually apply to you and there's things that aren't. So now I don't sit on a cushion because actually I don't need to. My body can sustain that. I'm fine. I don't travel with an indwelling either. I will either catheterize in a seat if I need to, if it's an emergency, or I'll transfer onto an aisle chair and I'll go to the toilet. It's not dignified, it's not easy, but that's a way to do it. If there's an aisle chair on board, there's always these other solutions. Or you catheterize before and after the flight. So there's all these hacks and tricks, and everyone will have their own. And that's the thing I found really kind of harmful at the time, was that there was this level of fear. It's frightening enough as it is, putting your wheelchair at risk. It goes out of sight, so you don't know what's going to happen to it until you get to the destination. That's scary, and unfortunately, for many people, there are challenges there that are very real, like having our chairs lost or damaged or broken, etc. But yeah, I think the way you look after yourself and the way you get on a flight, you just have to learn for yourself what you can do within those limits that they put on you on an airline, on an airplane, I should say.
I completely with you in terms of sort of getting to know yourself and how you interact really with the world and with your injury and what actually works for you. And it's kind of, self-advocacy, I guess, isn't it? Yeah. Just knowing yourself and what you need in that situation.
I get a lot of people messaging me saying, how do you do this? How do you do that? Because I try and share as much as I can on social media about the what work I get up to and stuff. And I'm like, I can't, it doesn't matter what I do. I can show you some hacks, tips that work for me, but you've got to work it out for yourself, because we're all different. And I think with people with spinal cord injury, there's there's a lot of advice out there, but you just need to take and apply for yourself what works for you.
Mm-hmm. Something I sort of wanted to ask from the beginning, I think for people who perhaps are less familiar with spinal cord injury, you said you were a T5 complete. How does that present for you?
So I'm paralysed from just underneath my boobs down, and I've got no feeling, no movement from there. So I don't have any core strength, so very little balance, very poor balance, I should say. The rest is kind of, I suppose, self-explanatory, no moving, no feeling. I don't have any feedback over the years, I should say, I've come to learn little signals and signs in my body that teach me and tell me about things that are going on. But that's taken a while to get that sort of map, understood. For example, if I get sweating on the lower part of my back, that usually means I need a wee. And it's really because I don't sweat below the level of my injury. So if I get a kind of sweating on the lower part of my back, I'm like, oh, that must mean I need a wee. So there's little things like that. And again, everybody's different, but I've figured out some of that so that I do get a bit of a clue of what's going on. But mostly as a complete injury, I have no, very little feedback. Well, no feedback. Yeah.
It's so interesting. Something that, we talk about all the time kind of in this community is just how every spinal cord injury is different. It really is. No two are the same. And it's the same, with sort of how you experience things. And that's why a lot of the time it's just time and understanding how you're going to, work and stuff.
Certainly as an impatient person, I'm like, that doesn't sound like a helpful thing to hear, that it will take time to adjust. But the fact is, it does. And the more you live with your changes in your body, the more you come to understand how you, A, feel about it, and B, how you manage it. It's been a journey. It's taken me a lot longer than I think some others. It took me almost 20 years to come to terms with some of the changes in my body, certainly around my sexuality and my sexual function and stuff like that. I found that really challenging, to be kind of missing that access to pleasure that I used to have, and figuring out how to get that back again. So there's so much you have to, be very honest with yourself about with your spinal injury, and be kind of like, and I think there's a real, what's the word? Like, finding a way to accept that there's a pain in the loss and the grief in the changes is okay. I think there's a lot of positivity put out there about, oh no, you can still do this. And I'm one of those people. I'll share, if you follow me on social media, you'll know I'm always like, look at how brilliant life is, even if you're paralyzed. But it's okay to make room for it's actually really hard, and really, like, there's a grieving that goes on with it. There's a pain. And I think we should be honest about that too. And that might stay with you forever. Like grieving, I suppose.
Totally agree with you on that. So many places I'd like to go. I think kind of at this point, I think what would be quite useful for people who are listening is for you to kind of talk through, because this episode is all about flying with a spinal cord injury or with a disability as a wheelchair user, talk us through the sort of stages you take from kind of booking a flight and then kind of getting to the airport, and what that looks like for you. Obviously, it is different for different people, but I think there's a lot of people out there with spinal cord injury who haven't flown and perhaps are scared to fly, so it might be useful to kind of hear, what that looks like for you.
So for me, it obviously starts with kind of knowing which airlines I slightly trust more than others. Trial and error has made me lean towards some and avoid others. But I don't know if it's helpful to share the names of these because everybody's different. So, for longer haul flights, there's some airlines that I trust a bit more. For short haul flights, you kind of don't really have much choice, do you? Just kind of go with the cheapest or whatever's available to you. So the booking process, yes, you kind of figure out which airlines you want to go with. And then you understand their actual processes. So every airline has unfortunately, seems to have a different set of standards when you book. Some you have to make the booking and then call them to add in your dimensions of your wheelchair, the weight, the height, the length, etc. If you're traveling with a battery, you also have to disclose that. Again, that can happen either over the phone or sometimes online. Every airline is different, but typically you've got to have that information in your head because you're going to get asked it, not just at the booking process, but again and again and again. It's quite tiresome. It doesn't seem like the system works, but that's just how it is. That when you get to the airport, people are just constantly asking you to repeat all the information about that you've already provided. So just be warned that's going to happen. So yeah, once booked, and if I'm honest, I travel a lot with work, so I have a bit of a policy. If I'm traveling over 5 or 6 hours, I won't travel in economy because my body and I do not sustain that well. I've had problems with pressure sores in the past not because of flights, but because of other things. And I can't do it, especially if I'm working and I'm expected to land and work. If I'm going on holiday, obviously, and it's all kind of I'm paying for it and it's all, an elective, but I've decided I'm going to fly, then I'll fly economy, obviously, and I will work out how to do that. But mostly if I'm flying for work, I'll try and just get that bit of extra room because it just makes me feel less scared, I suppose, of the damage it will do. So, yeah, I then get to the airport. I always go a little bit earlier than I should. I don't like being rushed, and my mum was a stewardess, so when I was growing up, timing for airports was always a thing. So she's instilled it in me, turn up at this point, turn up. So I always get really early. If I don't, I hate the stress and anxiety of just turning up late and being down to the wire. So I turn up early. Typically I go straight to the counter, even if I've checked in, and just say, look, is my assistance in the system? Do you have a record of me? Because sometimes I've turned up and you think it's booked in and it's not, and you get to the gate and nobody's there, and so I just don't trust the system, I suppose. So I always go and check with the person that check in, and there's usually an assistance desk, kind of part of the check-in of the airline that you're with. If not, just go to the premium. Even if you're not traveling in premium, just go to the premium counters because they tend to just be less people there, and just go up and say, hi, look, I'm flying with you. Is there a way you can check on my booking that my assistance is actually read in the system? Then normally, depending on the airport, some airports, like for example in France, if you fly to France and like Nice airport, they make it's mandatory that somebody assists you from check-in through the gates, through security to your gate, right? But some airports, they don't. They just let you go independently, should you choose to. You can book for assistance to come and take you and help you if you've got, that you want to push or something like that. But I tend to like to go by myself through security. And then, so security itself is, I think, the most invasive part of the journey, really. People will ask you about your mobility needs and like how you can mobilize and stuff. And obviously you've got to explain, I can't stand, I can't walk, etc. Then they'll do the pat down, all that stuff. So just be warned that it can be a little bit like, I don't know, a little bit invasive. But it depends on, again, what country you're in. I've had one, when I was in India one time, I had this, they refused to believe that I couldn't stand up. So they just gave me so much hell, and it was such a fight. I had to advocate, and like, you get used to when you fly, you have to advocate for yourself. So know your rights, like know what you can and can't do, which is a bit overwhelming. But anyway, I'll get to how you can find out more about that in a minute. So then you get through security, and then you're kind of hopefully like in just going through to your gate, and you can obviously do whatever in the airport. I tend to go to the toilet just before I get on a flight. So I leave it as last minute as possible. They'll ask you normally to get to your gate in good time. So I kind of like a little bit before boarding. So I tend to go to the toilet literally just before we start boarding. And then I go to the gate, and I will always say, like, right, is assistance here? And I'm always asking. I'm never assuming it's just going to turn up. And so chase the aisle chair, make sure that's in. And typically the process is you go and you pre-board. But that isn't always the case. Now, if you're traveling with something that's got a battery on it, this is where you tend to run into problems. People will start asking you, what's the battery size? What is it? How does it detach? How does it work? And I travel with a Batek, a wheelchair attachment that has a battery that I've made sure is the right size for flying, which is under 300 watt hours. So it's really important that when you fly, you know the information about your battery. You will run into problems. I've had people, even though I went through the booking process and put all that information in at the top, I've got to the gate and someone has just said, no, you can't travel with that. Or they'll say, right, how are you detaching it? Some will say you put it in the hold. Some will say you put it in the cabin. It's just like, it really is frustrating how much it varies. So just be warned that you will have to know about your battery, and you will have to know more about it than they do. And there is a chance that they might be idiots about it and turn you away. Let's just be honest. It can be that. But mostly they're getting more and more. The more we fly, the more airlines and airports are getting better at understanding. But I was in, Chile once, and they basically refused to let me fly because I had the battery, even though I'd flown all the way from the UK to Chile and was getting a connecting flight. They said, no, you can't fly with this battery. I said, I've just flown from the UK. So this is what I mean. It's variable, it's challenging, but look, it is possible. So again, I'll get to how you get around that in a minute. Then you get to the airplane door, and if you're like me and you can't mobilise at all, you get onto what's called an aisle chair. Now, an aisle chair varies, again, from airport to airport, country to country, but typically they are not in self-propelling chairs that somebody else pushes that you are strapped into, and you're then taken from your chair to your seat on the plane. Now, that's the bit that I think everybody hates the most, because it can be quite undignified if you can't transfer. It can be quite scary if the chairs are quite small and not well designed, and it can be a bit. But it's a means to an end, is all I'm going to say. And as long as you're clear about what you need to be able to do that transfer. So whether it's like, look, can you move my legs? Can you move my arms? Can you help me lift over to this seat? They should be trained enough to help you, and you should be fine. If you're capable of it. I mean, this is all dependent on your disability. Some people at this point, it's like they can't, and that's a fight we're taking to campaign against. So again, another subject. When you get on the seat, then that's when you decide if you want to sit on your cushion and put your cushion. I'd say take off loose bits from your chair when you say goodbye to it, because you're not going to see it again. It's going to go in the hole with the bags. So make sure it's tagged. Always make sure it's tagged. They either tag it at check-in or they tag it at the gate. And just always check. Then when you get to the seat, you can choose to sit on your cushion, like I said, which helps with pressure relief, or not, depending on what you need. I don't. I put it in the cushion in the overhead locker with my battery from my Batek. And then I typically like I said, it depends on the length of the flight. If the flight is under 4 or 5 hours, I won't drink, and I won't go to the toilet, and I will just wait till I get off the other end. It's a risk because, you know, something goes technical and you're sitting on the tarmac for 2 hours, which happened to me once. Like, you're like watching the clock going, oh my God, am I? So it can be scary. Now, this is when it depends on what airline you're flying with and on the air side and the size of the plane. Some airlines do not carry aisle chairs on board. People need to know that. They just do not. It's not a legal requirement for planes of a certain size to carry an aisle chair on board. So every time you get on, you say to them, do you have an aisle chair? I would always plan that they don't, because you just then plan for the worst. But most of the time, you know, especially on longer haul flights, but it's not guaranteed, but on longer haul flights, they tend to have them on board. You might find airlines cabin crew that don't know how to use them or assemble them. There's all other loads of stuff that needs to go into the training, but usually they do have them on board. But don't plan for it, because in case they don't, then you're stuck. And that's when you see people, unfortunately, having to drag themselves on the floor and get to toilets, and it's really awful, and it keeps happening. So, but what I do, because I don't travel with an indwelling catheter anymore, because I've did some quite a lot of damage when I was younger, just wearing these indwelling catheters, and it just wasn't good for my body. Again, each to their own, but it just didn't work for me. So I ended up like kind of banning myself from using them. And so what I take is a male catheter, a long male catheter, typically a female catheter, which I use to go to the toilet on the toilet. I use these longer ones, right? So what that allows me to do is then I keep, as an emergency, a longer catheter with me and a bottle or something to pee into. Because if the worst happens, you can always just put a rug over yourself and, you know, when people are asleep, catheterize. It's not the most dignified, but it's in an emergency, and if you don't want to drag yourself around. And I would just say that's my kind of it makes me feel less anxious if anything goes wrong. I tend to try and find a way to get to an aisle chair, or, like I said, wait until I land. And then, yeah, I pressure relieve, you know, as much as I would normally on the seat. I always wear really comfy clothes as well, like leggings and like loose stuff, because you swell up. And I don't really tend to eat or drink a lot on the flights because, again, scared about if I suddenly need to go to the toilet. And I've had some awful situations on flights where, like, I've been ill and I needed to get to the loo and, oh my God, all sorts of stuff. So I'd say also another hack is on the flight, carry spare stuff with you so like if you land and there's anything wrong with your baggage, like they've lost your luggage, you've got stuff enough, and just enough. I mean, not all of your medical supplies, but enough that you're going to be okay for a little bit of time, I'd say. So I always carry catheters and gloves and, like, if I'm taking oxybutynin, you know, whatever it is that you take, keep it with you. And then, yeah, I always say to the stewardesses and cabin crew, like, make sure my wheelchair's brought to the plane at the other end, and I refuse to get off the plane if they bring me anything other than my own chair. Like, some people will say, like, oh, you know, they'll say, oh, we'll just put you on an airport chair whilst we get your chair from the hold. No. Plane refuse. You don't have to, because otherwise that's where
I'm sitting here nodding my head, because I remember someone telling me that, and it's one of the pieces of advice that have really, really stuck with me. Just, you know, and I would say to anyone with a spinal cord injury who's, you know, got limited mobility at all, like, don't go anywhere until, you know, they can come to you and say your chair is sitting right there.
Absolutely. And, like, sometimes they'll take it to the baggage claim. Sometimes they'll put it on a different part of, like, you know, it will be like, they'll say things like, oh, we've just left it up at the top of the, like, where the jetty or something, like, we'll take you to it. No. You get on the aisle chair, sure, to get to the end of the plane, to get to the door, but that's it. You can't go any further. Like, you can't, You don't do it. Because it'll be one of those things that they can then, you'll be put in this chair, and that's it. You're going to get stuck. And it's not good. So don't do that. So, yeah, that's where you kind of have a bit more rights than I think people realise. And then, yeah, get off, and usually you'll get some sort of assistance person that can help you, and they can help you get your bag if you're travelling alone. Yeah, I think that's it.
Great advice. Love it. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I think the bladder thing is a thing for a lot of people, bladder and skin, really. And I think, you know, for me as well, I would always take my cushion with me. And, you know, I think you have your reasons, obviously, for, you know, not having an indwelling. For me, that's something for a long flight I would always do, because I'm able to, just because I like a drink, a cup of coffee, whatever, and, you know, I'm lazy, I don't want to have to transfer. But I have transferred before to an aisle chair, you know, and it has worked. So, you know, needs must kind of thing. But it's getting to know you and what you need, isn't it? Yeah, for 100%. Sure. So, I mean, you know, you were talking about kind of advice at the beginning that, you know, in the spinal centre they were giving you and stuff. For someone who is perhaps newly injured and they were looking to go on holiday, which is often a thing that comes up, you know, this whole series is about travel. What kind of advice would you give someone that hadn't flown before? I mean, beyond the practical things.
Don't let it stop you. I think unfortunately, there's a lot of bad news stories out there, mine included, of things like wheelchairs getting broken and people getting damaged, like by being dropped, and there's a lot of bad news. And for every one of those, there's probably 10 or 20 examples of times where things do not go wrong and everything's fine, and you land and everything's all good. So I think that there is, unfortunately, a fear that things are going to go wrong. I think you have to plan for the worst, but you do have to hope for the best, and you do have to do it. I'd say, so don't let your fear be the barrier. Ask, you know, others how they do it, figure it out, and bloody just go, because there's nothing better. I mean, Sophie, you and I are cut from the same cloth in that we love going on adventures, we always have, and travelling is like, it's the greatest feeling, and I just think if you're able to do it, and I mean that financially, I mean that physically, I mean that in every way that I mean by being able to do it, even though you have a disability, do it. Do it. Because the world is actually opening up in ways, certainly in the 20 years that I've been paralysed, it's changing every day, improving every day. There's so many amazing destinations now that are incredibly accessible and accommodating and aware of us as a, you know, and our needs. I think that with social media being out there, there's so much you can learn about how each of us do it and get there and manage. And I think it should be an inspirational, kind of aspirational process, I suppose. And I don't know. I think, what other advice would I give? Speak to one another. Speak to other people who have a similar disability to you. You know, paraplegics, for example, have different ways of travelling than others, and you know, there's just a lot you can learn. And I think that helps you plan for things. But also, I just say there is a moment where you're going to have to get out of your comfort zone, and that's a good thing. It's like where things grow and where things. I personally think the more I've travelled, the more I've learned about my disability. It's a great leveler learner, and it's great kind of, for me, it's sort of expedited my processes of getting more comfortable and familiar with my disability. The more I travel, the more I learn about myself. The more I travel, the more I understand my needs. Like it's for me the way to find peace and happiness. But not everyone's the same. But you know, going on holiday is like it's like it should be a human right? So we are certainly like allowed and permitted that experience. So I'd say, don't assume that you can't. In fact, assume that you can and just find a way.
I love this. I love this so much. It makes me want to ask you this question that I have for you. And I know you've travelled all over the world. You've travelled extensively and you've been injured for some time. So you've fitted a lot in that time. Probably a difficult one, but what is your top travel memory, or what is one that's like right up there that stands apart that you would share with us?
Oh God, Soph, it's so hard to answer. In many ways, the one that stands out the most is the Canadian trip with the jet skiing just after my injury, because I have been chasing that feeling ever since, really, which is the feeling of, oh my God, I can do amazing things still, and I can experience the world as a paraplegic, and I can have an experience that equals that of those who are not disabled. And of an experience that I would have loved, paralysed or not. So I've been that trip was seminal. But since then, I'd say, gosh, last year I have an adapted 3-wheel bike. It's called a Can-Am. If anyone wants to look it up, it's a Can-Am, spelled CANAM. Spider, Spyder, and I've got one of them, and it's modified to it, so it's got a handbrake system on it. It's basically like the coolest thing I've ever. I love it beyond. I can't even tell you how much I love it. And I rode it across the States last year to celebrate my 20-year anniversary. So it was a month-long ride from DC all the way across to LA, and it was so much fun. And I think for me, I've found places now that I feel less disabled. You know, and I've been on the journey trying to figure out where is the place that I feel most free and liberated, and the States is that place for me. And I absolutely adore being here. I adore it. And so like riding my bike here was just the best. So I think those are probably the best. Those are probably the best. But there's many.
Good choices. I mean, yeah, I remember seeing kind of pictures and stuff of that, and I was like, yes, so living the dream. That really is living the dream, isn't it?
It's really fun. And whacking my chair on the back and just setting it into the world is just so much fun. Honestly.
It's very cool, that total independence and stuff. Have a last couple of questions before we round things off. You've given so much kind of great advice, and you've travelled extensively in lots of different ways, not just by plane. Have you got kind of one like top travel tip, really, about just travel in general, more broadly?
It's a little bit unusual for me to say this because I haven't had the luxury of doing this or the privilege of being able to do it, because in many ways I've found my own path. But what I would say, one tip is, certainly if you're newly injured, follow in the footsteps of those who have done it before. Because you can trust, if you're following someone like me and you can see that I've just gone to this place and it's worked, just go there too, because like we've done the work, you know what I mean? And I didn't have that luxury 20 years ago. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have social media. I didn't have any way. You
didn't have a Sophie Morgan that I did.
No, them still weren't out there, but we didn't have to follow each other, you know.
Well, and a mentor like that, you know. But yeah.
It was one of those where you had to like figure it out for yourself. You don't have to do that anymore. There's enough of us. There's enough wheelchair users out there having gone places. And if you do have that anxiety that you don't want to step out of your comfort zone too much, follow those who've done it. Just follow us. And you'll feel like this sense of ease that actually, you know, when you get there, it's not all going to be this like challenging, scary, like barriers everywhere. Like we've done the work to break those barriers down. If you are, however, a bit more of a trailblazer, go do the thing and just plan for the worst, but hope for the best. That's all I always say. Like, go do the thing. Go somewhere that no one as a wheelchair user has been before, but make sure that you know you're going to have to fight with certain barriers. So learn how to advocate. So, for example, I talked earlier about like knowing your rights on flights. Now, for example, if you're going somewhere and you know it's a small airline and they probably don't get a lot of wheelchair users coming through, and it's in the back of beyond and there's no like, they don't have much provision. I mean, I've been in like countries where it's a small airport and they don't even have an aisle chair, you know, things like that. Like, I know what I'm getting myself into, so I know to plan for it. Now, you can make that choice if you want to. You just have to measure your expectations. So what I was saying earlier with knowing your rights, things like with your battery, screen grab the laws of that country, okay, and keep it on your phone. So that for example, in the US, it's under their legal requirements, most airlines have to make provision to have a wheelchair travel, if it's collapsible, on the plane. And you can screen grab it and you can show them, look, this is what it says in your laws. Do you know what I mean? Like, know your rights. So like with the battery thing, I have a screen grab of what the Civil Aviation Authority in the UK permit on an aeroplane. And I screen grab it and I keep it on my phone. And like at one time, a captain tried to throw me off a flight because he didn't believe that my battery was safe to travel. And I just showed him this thing. I barely even looked at him. I just went, I just think you should just read that. And it makes you feel so much more empowered, so much more safe when you know your rights. So, look, again, if you're somebody who's going into the great unknown and you don't think anyone's been there before, as long as you know and you can sort of try and advocate and learn how to do that for yourself, then you're set up a little bit more for success. But at the end of the day, it's challenging out there. So you're going to have thick skin and you're going to have to just yeah, like I said, plan for the worst.
I love that. I love both those kind of pieces of advice, about actually there are people out there. I think a lot of us, some of us are kind of, they want to adventure and they want to figure stuff out for themselves and they don't necessarily want to, maybe even take the easy route sometimes, but having kind of been there and been that person and struggled and stuff. I mean, I always say, find others in a similar situation, talk to others and learn from others.
I did it with you, Soph. You'd gone out to Winter Park to go and live there and ski and do your seasons and stuff. And I was like, right, Soph's done it. I can follow Soph. So I lent on you. You know what I mean? It was like I knew that you knew certain things around that, like Winter Park, where I could stay. We stayed together. Do you know what I mean? Like that was me learning from you. And now you can go online and you can follow an endless number of us. So I've just been to the Rockies. And if you've ever thought about, just save that by posts about the Rockies and just say, oh, I've wanted to go to Canada to the Rockies. I'll save that. Now I know that Sophie's done it. Log it. And then a few years down the line, you're looking for a trip. You've got it saved. Someone's done it. And you can go and, find from the horse's mouth, from the disabled person, this has worked. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's a perfect source of kind of inspiration to, actually see what other people have done before. And there's some crazy stuff, that people have, with disabilities have done. I mean I don't know your account alone.
Darren Edwards, I don't know if you follow him. He's this amazing adventurer. He just went across the North Pole. He's got spinal cord injury with Ed Jackson, who's got spinal cord injury. I'm like, what are these people doing? It's just amazing. So, there's an endless source of info out there and inspo. But also, like we said, if you want to go do the thing, both of us can attest to the joy that you get when you actually figure it out and you go and do it yourself and you go somewhere that you don't know what's going to happen, but you get there and it works. It's just, it makes you feel really brave.
100%. Couldn't agree more. I'm really looking forward to your answer for this last question, which is, so what would you say your top tip or one of your top tips for living well with a spinal cord injury?
It's a hard one because I think I break it into different categories. Because I think there's different areas of sort of personal development that I think you need to focus on. So I break them into 5. So your health, your wealth, your finances, your personal development, and your relationships. Okay, those areas are the areas I always try and break it down into areas like that, and set goals within each of them, because I think each of them need attention for your life to be as good as it can be. So, for example, in relationships, I don't just mean intimate relationships. I mean relationships with your friends and your family and with your community and with others. That is absolutely as important as making sure that you look after your body and that you rest it, that you give it what it needs, which is as important as making sure you put some money aside if you can to be able to protect yourself and give yourself choice when you travel. So if you end up at a hotel that's not accessible and you need to book another one, you've got a bit of safety there, because you're otherwise. I think money and trying to be sensible about it for us. We know it costs more to be disabled, but it's so important that when you travel in particular, that you just have a little bit of a buffer to protect yourself should things go wrong. For example, I think also, for me, I've always wanted to be financially in a position where my disability isn't the biggest barrier, if that makes sense. So I've always tried to use what I earn in a way that allows my disability to not feel like such a barrier, if that makes sense. And then personal development. I think always have a purpose, always have a mission, always have something, because it pulls you through the dark days. Like for me, whenever I've been on bed rest, and I've spent numbers of years on bed rest for various reasons, and I've spent time in really big setbacks that were felt so insurmountable, bigger than just being paralysed in a spinal cord injury, like all of these secondary complications that have come from my injury and other setbacks in my personal life, my professional life. The thing that always keeps me going, and I think the thing that is the tip that I always kind of lean on, but again, like I said, not in isolation, is just to keep going. And the way you keep going is you have a purpose, you have something you're holding on to, whether that's as big as wanting to change the world, which is something I do all the time. It's my motivation to try and improve just the lived experience of disabled people, and it feeds into every bit of my life and my work. But it can be anything from your purpose is just being a good mum, or just I don't know, wanting to like be a better member of a community, whatever the thing is that gets you out of bed, that doesn't change just because you're spinal injury. And I think you keep hold of that, keep that as a target, and it will keep you right. It will keep you going, even when things are really, really shitty.
Love that so much.
Yes, quite a lot. 5 tips.
Oh, so much good stuff. Sophie, thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy, and I think a lot of people out there will find it really, really inspiring, and it'll encourage them to go and travel, which is kind of the whole point of this series.
I hope so. I just want to leave that message of like, it's doable. It's doable, and it's actually it should be mandatory. You should make it aware. You know, if you can't fly because you have a spinal cord injury that it's just you couldn't sustain a flight, just jump in the car, just jump on the train, just do the thing, because it's you know, we have enough challenges in our day-to-day lives in our body. There's so much world out there that's worth seeing, and it's worth it.
And we're entitled to see it just like the next person, you know, disability or not. It's out there for us too. Exactly. Amazing. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure, Soph.
You've been listening to the Back Up and Thriving Accessible Travel podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please do give us a rating, review, and subscribe or follow on Spotify, because this helps us reach more people that might enjoy or even benefit from listening. See you next time.